Well, good morning. This morning we're going to look at 8 evolutionary myths that are still taught in public school today. And what we're going to see is the scientific case for macroevolution is so weak that the proponents are forced to use disproven examples. What are we going to look at this morning? Some of the examples that are still used in textbooks today are animal homology, embryology, the peppered moth, alleged horse evolution, Neanderthal man, Darwin's finches, alleged fruit fly evolution, and vestigial organs. And one thing we're going to emphasize is that in order for evolution to occur, macroevolution, new genes are required. They have to have new genetic information. We'll point that out later on. We're going to start out with a quote. And I'm just going to read excerpts of the quote. It's not taken out of context, but I'm trying to shorten it here for the sake of time. This is Dr. Pierre-Paul Grosset, past president of the French Academy of Sciences. Regarding evolution, he said, biologists must think about the weaknesses they lay down as truths. The deceit is sometimes unconscious, but not always, since some people purposely overlook reality and falsity of their beliefs. But as Christians, we know that in dealing with others on this subject or any subject, we have to be straightforward, truthful, upright. Christians must be different. 2 Corinthians 4:2 says, "But we have renounced the hidden things of shame, not walking in craftiness, nor handling the word of God deceitfully, but by manifestation of the truth, commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God." So the first disproven dogma that's still taught today is animal homology. This is one of the most common that's taught. It's also called comparative anatomy as studied in school, and really it's just similarities in animals. So we'll give one example. You have the forelimb, and many animals are very similar. You notice all the animals up here, their forelimbs, you see some commonality. In the human, you have the humerus, the radius and ulna, the carpals, metacarpals, and then the phalanges, or the fingers. And we can see homologous organs or bones for each of these other animals. Now, the evolutionists say this is because of common ancestry, but they discount the possibility that it could be a common designer. They say no divine foot is allowed in the door. Well, let's use another example. Here you have the 1953 to the 1984 Corvette. You see many similarities in these. But do they all have the same ancestor? Did they evolve from one another? No. They have a common designer, which is called General Motors. So the question is, what would discredit the Darwinian evolution model of homology? One thing would be identical homologous structures in animals that appear in different evolutionary lines. That is, the same organs in animals that did not evolve from one another. They just coincidentally have the same organs or non-inherited similarities. One we can look at is a similar organ in the vertebrates and the mollusks. These supposedly diverged millions of years ago, evolved down different evolutionary lines, but they have the exact same eye. They both have an eye that has an eyelid, a cornea, a pupil, an iris, a ciliary muscle, a lens, retina, an optic nerve or ganglion, as well as the vitreous humor in the middle of the eye. Now, how did they supposedly evolve the same eye? Well, evolutionists say we know that. That's convergent evolution. That is code for saying they just accidentally evolved the same structure. Now, it's impossible that the eye, I believe, could even evolve in the first place. But to believe that it evolved down different lines, identically the same, is beyond the realm of possibility. Here you have the octopus eye and the human eye. One is on the bottom of the sea, and one is climbing Mount Everest and walking on the moon. And we're supposed to believe that they both evolved the same organ. Impossible to believe. Also, the second thing, Consider this. If similarities indicate common ancestry, what should we find that proves they were coded or blueprinted the same? We should find the same genes, the same genetic information, the same DNA that codes for these organs. To set up the next quote, we've known since the 1890s when Hugo de Vries rediscovered Mendelian genetics from the creationist Gregor Mendel that there were genes that are matched to structures in the body. So Dr. Gavin de Beer in 1971 made this statement: what mechanism results in homologous organs, the same patterns, in spite of their not being controlled by the same genes? I asked this question in 1938, and it has not been answered today. How can you have the same organs, the same patterns, and not have the same genes? He says he can't come up with an answer. Well, the answer is simple: a common designer. God uses the same organ in different animals, but uses different genes to code for them. So the take-home message for the first point is similarities suggest a common designer rather than a common ancestor. The second disproven dogma is embryo, a simple method for explaining macroevolution to the common man in Germany, since most people were not buying Darwin's theory. So what he did is come up with a series of wood carvings that could be stamped, and you see, notice in the third group here, we see that all these animals look different in the embryonic state. But in the first stage, they all look the same. So he said, you see, they all look the same. We all evolved from a common ancestor, since embryology recapitulates evolution, and therefore we all evolved from some tadpole-like amphibian creature. Well, the problem is he faked the drawings. Notice the drawings or the wood carvings above and compare it with the actual pictures of these embryos. Do they look even closely the same? No, they were fakes. But don't take my word for it. Listen to Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard professor and paleontologist. He said Haeckel exaggerated the similarities in a procedure that can only be called fraudulent. We have the right to be astonished by these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks. In the year 2000, Michael Richardson and an international team of experts re-examined Haeckel's drawings, and this is the conclusion they came to in Science magazine. It looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology, yet it's still used in the textbooks today. The take-home message: Darwinists even admit that Haeckel's embryos are frauds. Embryology proves nothing about our origin. The next is the English peppered moth. You might recall this in your textbooks today. The English peppered moth is one that a man by the name of Bernard Kettlewell used as an example. Also, he was looking for an example to demonstrate a simple explanation for macroevolution. So he noticed that in these pepper moths, there were two variants. There was a light-colored moth and a dark-colored moth. Well, about that time, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a large amount of soot, coal soot, that was put out from factories in large cities such as Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool. What this did is kill the light-colored lichen on the trees and turn the trees dark. When the trees turned dark, the dark-colored moths were able to camouflage themselves on the trees. And then the proportion of dark-colored moths increased and the proportion of light-colored moths decreased. And Bernard Kettlewell said this was because birds were then able to eat the light-colored moths off the trees, killing them and leaving the dark-colored moths. And he said this is evolution in action, evolution in progress. Well, based on our lecture yesterday, what would you say in response to this? This is nothing more than microevolution, variation within a kind. You have some darker dogs, some lighter dogs. You have some darker skinned people with more pigment and some with less pigment. It's only variation within a kind. There is no new genetic information being added. Now, even though this is still used in the textbooks today, I want you to notice a quote from 51 years ago. Dr. L. Harrison Matthews, who was a professor at Bristol University and the scientific director of the Zoological Society of London, was honored to write the foreword to the 1971 edition of Darwin's Origin of Species. And he said this: "The peppered moth experiments show survival of the fittest, but they do not show evolution in progress." If we've known that for 51 years, then why is it still being used in the textbooks today? Even Jerry Coyne, evolutionist, biological evolutionist from Chicago University, had this to say in the journal Nature: "These examples represent the loss of traits rather than the origin of evolutionary novelty." What does that mean, the loss of traits? Is that evolving? No, that's devolving. That would be devolution, if you will. Now, besides all that, there were serious problems with Kettlewell's experiments. I was only going to go through one of these, but I think we have time to go through the other ones. The dark-colored moths in unpopulated areas actually increase just as in populated areas. The dark-colored moths continue to increase after the light-colored camouflage returned to the trees. And in one area, light-colored moths began to increase in proportion before the light-colored lichen even returned to the trees. And worst of all, it was documented in signed statements that Kettlewell actually pinned and glued these moths to the trees in order to film the birds eating them off the trees. Because you see, these moths never lived on the trunks of trees in the first place. They're nocturnal. They only come out at night, and they live high in the trees on the underside of branches, where birds usually do not hunt for them. So the take-home message from these peppered moths are variation within an animal kind, microevolution, does not prove macroevolution. Number 4, alleged horse evolution. When I was at the University of Georgia, I had a good friend, a colleague, and she believed in macroevolution. And I asked her one day, "What do you consider the strongest proof for evolution?" That's a question I like to ask people. You should ask some people and see what their examples are. They're probably going to give examples like we gave yesterday, microevolution. Well, she said, well, of course, without batting an eye. She said, well, of course, the horse evolution. The picture of the little horse turning into the bigger horse. Well, what would your response be based on our lesson yesterday? Well, that's just microevolution. You have different varieties of horses. Well, worse than that, it's been shown, even the evolutionists admit, that these horses did not evolve from one another, even though it's still used in the textbooks today. They admit that all 4 of the last 4 horses, all but Hyracotherium, which is Eohippus, or the dawn horse, the first one, they believe all 4 others were contemporary to one another. They all existed at the same time. Therefore, they couldn't have evolved from one another if they lived at the same time. But wait, there's more. We can roll back the clock to 1993. In 1993, Stephen Jay Gould again and his colleague Niles Eldredge in the journal Nature wrote this: "Throughout the history of horses, the species are static over millions of years. The gradualistic picture of horse evolution becomes a bush of overlapping, closely related species." They overlapped. They didn't evolve from one another. Now, this isn't me. This is the evolutionist saying this, and yet it's still used in the textbooks. Well, there's more. Let's go back further. 1986, Dr. Stephen Stanley from Johns Hopkins University wrote this in Bioscience. He said, the horse is the classic story of one genus turning into another. Now it's becoming apparent that there's an overlap of these genera. There isn't just a simple gradual transition from one horse to another. But there's more. Let's go back to 1954. Dr. Niels Herbert Nielsen, who was a Swedish geneticist from University of Lund, said the family tree of the horse is continuous only in the textbooks. The construction of the horse is very artificial and cannot therefore be a continuous transformation series. 1 year earlier, George Gaylord Simpson, who is one of the architects of the modern synthesis of evolution, along with another man that we'll point out, he helped come up with what is currently believed, neo-Darwinism, in 1953, said the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Now, if we knew this in 1953, then why is it still going to be taught tomorrow in public schools? I think the answer is simple, because they don't have anything better to use. So the take-home message, horse evolution never happened. We're moving pretty quickly through here. Number 5, Darwin's finches. Now this is one that's touted as one of Darwin's strongest proofs of evolution that is in almost universally all textbooks. And as the story goes, in 1831, when Darwin traveled around the world on the HMS Beagle, he stopped about 600 miles west of Ecuador on the Galapagos Islands. This is a series of, it's an archipelago and a series of about 125 different islands. Well, on these islands, he found a group of finches, different finches on different islands, and he discovered 9 species of finches on the islands, and he came to the conclusion that all these finches must have come from a common ancestor. In fact, he didn't even come to this conclusion until years later, based on his drawings. It wasn't really when he was there, it was an afterthought. But he concluded, well, since these finches have different beaks, they must have evolved and they must have come from a common ancestor, the mainland finch. Well, based on what we studied yesterday, what would you conclude? What did Darwin prove? Nothing more than variation within a kind. There are different lengths of beaks. Well, people have different lengths of noses. Different animals have different lengths of snouts. And yet they can still be the same kind. Well, what's the point here? There are fewer differences in Darwin's finches than the 339 breeds of dogs in the world. Yet no one says that these dogs are different species. They say they're the same species, and the dogs aren't changing into anything else. So what's really going on here? Well, the point is there's no new genetic information being added. Information is actually being lost. That's a key point to remember, and something that you need to ask your teachers. What should you ask your teachers? And this applies to almost universally any example they will give. So if Darwin's finches demonstrate macroevolution, what new genes have been added to the finch genome? And see what their answer is. Because information is the key to evolution. You have to have new genes, new genetic information. Point 6. Were the Neanderthals humans or unevolved ape-like creatures? we're told that these Neanderthals weren't really humans. They had thicker skulls, larger ridge brows, and thus they must have been a non-human related species. Well, I'm going to argue today that Neanderthals were human, just as human as we are. Here are some clues that Neanderthal people were humans. They are known to have created and hunted with weapons, created and admired artwork, set broken bones. They created musical instruments. It's even been shown that they have the same notes, the same patterns that we used in some of the musical instruments that have been found. They made and used tools. They even built and rode in ocean-sailing vessels. And they say they weren't human. They observed religious practices. They buried their dead with honors. We find them buried with flowers and other such things. They spoke intelligible languages. They cultivated and used pigment. They cooked their food, even vegetables. And since the 1950s, secular scientists have even admitted that their anatomy falls within the range of human beings living today. And we're told that they had a larger cranium capacity. That indicates a larger brain. You would think that maybe they were even smarter than we are. But modern science has shown that there are even humans living today that have the same cranial capacity, the same brain size that they did. They even admit today that they lived at the same time as humans. They walked like humans. They acted like humans. And here's the kicker, they even interbred with humans. So the take-home message is Neanderthals were human. Point number 7 is fruit fly evolution. We were taught that fruit flies, being one of the easiest biological forms to mutate, proved evolution because you could show mutations in them. In the 7th grade, we used mutagenic chemicals to mutate fruit flies, which changed many parts of their bodies. It changed their wings, their abdomen, their legs, and their eyes. And so it created these morphological mutations. But the most common mutation was the four-winged fruit fly. This is the mutation that everyone tries to produce because it's so interesting, a four-winged fruit fly. That has to be evolution in progress, doesn't it? Well, I want to introduce you to a principle that I like to call the PBS principle. So in order for neo-Darwinian evolution to be true, the mutations must have these three important characteristics. And I call it PBS, and that's easy to remember because PBS teaches macroevolution. First of all, the mutations must be persistent. That means they must be able to continue on to the next generation. Well, is that possible with the fruit flies? Well, with the four-winged fruit fly, this is one they claim that proves evolution. With the four-winged fruit fly, they are unable to breed. And since they're unable to breed, you cannot pass it down to the next generation. Number 2, they have to be beneficial. Remember, for Darwinian evolution to be true, you have to have two things. You have to have mutations in the genes, and then you have to have survival of the fittest. They have to be able to outcompete the wild type in the wild. Well, can these four-winged fruit flies, if they're released into the wild, will they persist and have beneficial characteristics? No, because they cannot fly, nor can they walk. These are genetic mutants that are unable to survive in the wild. Third, they have to be structural, and it is structural. It is a change in structure, but they cannot persist and breed, nor can they survive in the wild. So the translation favorable structural changes must be passed down to progeny. So this is what you should ask your teacher about fruit flies, if you're ever taught this in school. So if fruit fly mutations demonstrate macroevolution, what new genes have been added to the fruit fly genome? You have to have new information. The take-home message: fruit flies are not evolving into anything other than fruit flies. Point number 8 is vestigial organs. Vestigial organs have been touted for years as one of the strongest proofs of evolution. And I see some people smiling. You've been taught this, I'm sure, in school, and have been led to believe that these are organs that have just disappeared over time and were useful in your evolutionary past, but they're no longer needed today, so they're disappearing. Well, Edersheim, years ago, a German in the 1920s, claimed that there were over 200 vestigial organs that are no longer needed in the body. Some of the common usual suspects are the tonsils, the tailbone or the coccyx, and the appendix. They are told to be disappearing. Well, what should you ask your teacher about vestigial organs? You should ask, so if vestigial organs demonstrate macroevolution, what new genes have been added to the animal's genome? Well, this wouldn't be evolution, would it, if they are losing characteristics? If you're losing genetic information, you need to gain genetic information. This would be devolution, if you will. One example that people use, and they're taught in school, is that these fish that live in caves where it's very dark, over time they have lost their eyes. So they're fish that no longer have eyes. And they say, see, that's the strongest proof of evolution. Well, again, they're not gaining anything. They're losing something. That's devolution and not evolution. There's a book I would recommend, Vestigial Organs Are Fully Functional. This is by Drs. Bergman and Howe. And in this book, they show that all 200 of these organs that we're taught are no longer useful, are still useful and still have useful purposes in the body, such as the eyelashes, eyebrows, the outer ear, and other organs. But we can even roll back the clock to 1981. In 1981, Dr. S.R. Scatting, in the journal Evolutionary Theory, said this: vestigial organs provide no evidence for evolutionary theory. Now, if we knew that in 1981, why is it still used in the textbooks today? Again, because they don't have any better examples to use. And so, notice yet in 1997 what Encyclopedia Britannica said about the appendix. The whole quote says, the appendix does not serve any useful purpose as a digestive organ in humans, and it is believed to be gradually disappearing in the human species over evolutionary time. And that's what we were taught in school. But let's roll back the clock even further to 1976. In 1976, Dr. G. McHardy in the journal Gastroenterology had this to say. This is the whole quote: the appendix is not generally credited with significant function. However, current evidence tends to involve it in the immunologic mechanism. So the appendix is useful as an immune system organ. In a standard medical textbook, Dr. Keith L. Moore, the textbook Clinically Oriented Anatomy that you see here, described the appendix as a well-developed lymphoid organ. So we know it is useful. Some things that I have read show that it may be useful, especially in infants and in young children, in helping to develop the immune system of the body. Next are the tonsils. We have been told that tonsils are not needed. They're just vestigial from the past. And a lot of people get their tonsils removed. In fact, there was a time in this country when almost any time a child would go in for some kind of surgery, they would recommend that they go ahead and get their tonsils removed. Well, look at what Wikipedia says all the way back in 2008. Like other organs of the lymphatic system, the tonsils act as part of the immune system to help protect against infection. In particular, they are believed to be involved in helping fight off pharyngeal and upper respiratory tract infections. That's even Wikipedia makes that statement. So we know the tonsils are actually useful and are a lymphoid organ. The next one is the coccyx, a very popular one that's used, or the tailbone. You see, we have this tailbone because we used to be apes, and we used to use the tail for balancing in the trees. In this cartoon, this professor says, vestigial organs like the human tailbone prove that we evolved from animals with tails. And this student says, sir, there are 9 muscles that attach to the tailbone. It is not vestigial. The tailbone is shown to be useful. It actually helps hold up the pelvic girdle and is useful for elimination of body wastes. Next are the wings of flightless birds. These are birds such as the ostrich, the emu, and the rhea. We're told in their evolutionary past they used to fly. And since they used to fly, over time they stopped flying and they simply began walking, and yet they still have their wings, which are a vestige from the past. And their wings serve no function. Well, we know that their wings actually serve many functions. How do we know that the Creator didn't make the bird without the ability to fly, but gave their wings and provided them with wings to have other uses? Some things the wings are used for is for a cooling mechanism. If I know there's poultry farms in this area of the country. If you've ever been into a chicken house, you'll notice when it's warm, the chickens will sit down and hold their wings out. It's used as a cooling mechanism. These wings are also used to protect chicks. They're useful in a fall to protect the internal organs. And they're also useful for balance in running and breeding. Without the wings, they may not be able to even breed. So we see that these are not vestigial. These are actually useful. And then one that is extremely popular is the hip bones in whales, or they're called hip bones. These are bones at the posterior of the whale that we are told are there from their vestigial past when whales used to be cow-like animals that walked on land. Actually, we were told that first there were animals in the ocean that evolved into land animals and then went back into the ocean. Well, we know that these bones are actually useful and they're helpful in breeding. So they are not vestigial. I'm going to give you a quote from Dr. H.S. Lipson. In 1980, he had an article called "A Physicist Looks at Evolution" in the journal Physics Bulletin. He was University of Manchester head of the Department of Physics and fellow of the Royal Society. And he made this statement: in fact, evolution became, in a sense, a scientific religion. Almost all scientists have accepted it, and many are prepared to bend their observations to fit with it. Well, we shouldn't be surprised when falsehoods concerning origins are peddled as truth. The Bible even warns us that there will be those that do such. In 2 Peter 2, verses 1 and 2, there we read, "But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed." And then the next verse is what some like to call the intelligent design verse of the Bible. In Romans 1:20, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." I've given a number of resources in the back, and one of the resources is a recommended reading list. These are the books that I would highly recommend that you get, and there are also some web pages on there. Some of these web pages I would recommend are listed on the screen. I would recommend the first one, as that's my most highly recommended web page. You can bookmark these in your browser. Creation.com, this is Creation Ministries International, and this is out of Australia. The website is composed of articles that are written by different scientists from around the world. Many of these people have to use pseudonyms, fake names, so that they don't hurt their career. Next is Answers in Genesis. Some of you are familiar with that. The Creation Museum and the Ark. International ICR. Apologetics Press is one that Brethren run. Creation Wiki is one that's a Wikipedia type website that is has an interface where you can actually add comments and they can be incorporated. And finally is trueorigin.org. If you ever talk to an atheist, often they like to go to a website called Talk Origins. Talk Origins is a atheist macroevolution website that responds to many of the arguments we're making this weekend. Well, creationists have responded to that, and they have come up with this website, trueorigin.org, that responds to those arguments that are made. I had planned for a shorter talk this morning, and so that just about wraps it up. I think we're going to end about 5 minutes early, if that's okay. And so I think we will end there.
Thank you for watching this video. We're glad that you have found our channel, and in fact, while you're here, we would encourage you to subscribe to the Jones Road Church of Christ channel. We have several videos already up, and we believe you'll find these to be true to God's Word, helpful to you in your journey toward God. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us and let us know how we can help you.